When you think Xenoblade Chronicles, there may be a lot of things that come to mind. Perhaps fond memories of your experiences with the series, or maybe just some knowledge of that RPG series you've never played. Its origins began late in the Wii's lifecycle when developer Monolith Software, who was bought out by Nintendo, began to work on a new project initially titled Monado: Beginning of the World. It was renamed to Xenoblade out of respect for the creator Tetsuya Takahashi, referencing his previous works, and has since been incorporated into the larger Xeno meta series. After some difficulties with launch, it eventually became one of the most beloved titles on the system for the niche audience that played it. It would end up spawning two sequels, one called Xenoblade X on the Wii U that didn't do very well because of the failure of the console, and then Xenoblade 2 on the Nintendo Switch. Because of this game, over the past 3 years the Xenoblade franchise has been rapidly growing in popularity. The Nintendo Switch ended up becoming a massive commercial success, and Xenoblade 2 was one of the flagship titles during the first year of its release. While a commercially successful game that started making the franchise more popular, it appeared to be a bit divisive within the community, as many fans of the original game didn't like many aspects of the second game diverging from what was in the original. Fortunately for these fans of the first game, they would eventually find their own salvation when Definitive Edition was announced. The hype grew to new heights and expectations even higher, as many who started with Xenoblade 2 and many fans of the original couldn't wait to get their hands on the remake. And then the game finally launched at a time when the world needed it most in the dark ages of 2020. Was it able to live up to all of its hype? Is Xenoblade Definitive Edition a masterpiece, or is it overrated? Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition has been out for a little over a month now, and if you've been following my channel at all, you know I've been covering it extensively with a lot of guide content to help everyone understand the game more and have more fun. In this video, I'm going to analyze the game in detail. I'm going to talk about everything I liked and everything I disliked. This is going to be from the perspective of someone who has experienced all the games multiple times in the Xeno franchise, and if you do disagree with some aspects of this video, I still hope you'll be able to perhaps see it from a different perspective. It should go without saying, but this video is going to be very spoiler heavy. I will put Future Connected in its own section, however, at the end, so if you haven't beaten that, feel free to watch until then. So let's talk about Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition. When the remake was announced in September of last year, my first reaction wasn't actually one of hype. I kinda just groaned because at the time that was not the kind of Xeno-related announcement I wanted. I really wanted a new game and a new experience rather than development time and resources being used on this project. I enjoyed my initial experience with Xenoblade 1 when I first played, but when I tried to replay it again in 2016 or so, I felt like it aged a bit poorly since I already knew the story and much of the gameplay felt like a slower version of Xenoblade Chronicles X. Still, I wanted to be optimistic about the possible changes they could make to the game that I think would have improved it. Maybe some updated combat, some nice quality of life features, some extra endgame content. All of this helped me remain reasonably optimistic, especially since I still considered the game one of my favorite experiences, and I genuinely felt like it would be nice to experience the game again. I had spent basically the past 2.5 years playing Xenoblade 2 without getting bored, so maybe I could enjoy the first game just as much. As release approached, it appeared like there was going to be some nice changes to quality of life features, and there was even a time attack mode that I got really excited for. Future Connected was also hyped up to give us some hints about the future of the series, so there was a lot to be optimistic about. So how did this stack up when it finally released? If there is one thing I can say for certain about this game is that it is definitely the best way to experience the original Xenoblade Chronicles. You can easily tell this is what it was intended to be back when it was initially created in 2010. With that in mind, let's discuss the game. One of the most fundamentally important aspects to a game is the gameplay, and in the case of RPGs, the combat. No matter how good a narrative or graphics a game may have, if the game itself isn't fun to play, it's hard to consider it a good game. This is the major problem Xenosaga 2 had, for instance, where it was a lot of amazing story content at least worth playing for, but the game itself dragged it down the experience greatly. When I initially got Xenoblade 1, I knew nothing about the story. I only got it because I watched some gameplay videos online showing off a cool combat system I had never seen before, so I ended up buying it because I wanted to play it. All these years later, and in the remake, the system has not been changed at all. On the upside, this meant everything was basically figured out already as far as knowing the good strategies, and it was very easy to make videos for. On the downside, this meant that everything was basically figured out already, and there wasn't much to experiment with or explore about the system. The combat itself starts off pretty light at the beginning of the game with only a few arts available to you and longer art cooldowns since the arts are not leveled up yet. Many of these fights you'll be standing or moving around the enemy while auto-attacking and waiting for your arts to come off cooldown. This makes the system feel very slow to me at the beginning, which is, funnily enough, a criticism of Xenoblade 2 that I disagree with. Being able to move while auto-attacking seems to be pretty nice at first, but the time-based cooldowns of arts and the lack of auto-attack canceling to feel like you're constantly doing something definitely hurt this game in the early game. There are many times I was just standing around waiting for the cooldowns and just watching my characters auto-attacking, which is definitely something I don't want to be doing. Over time, you'll get more arts and lower cooldowns from leveling them, so that becomes much less of an issue. If you have the right setups and are using the right characters, there will be significantly less downtime later on, and the combat will feel much more fluid and fun. I was really enjoying myself once I got to the mid to late game with all the options I had unlocked with getting all the arts and characters finally. I feel like this is one of those games where you can't really enjoy it if you continue to play the same character. You have to swap around who you're controlling occasionally to keep things fresh. Otherwise, you'll quickly notice that pretty much every fight you're going to be doing the exact same art combo, such as Dunban starting with Peerless, into Gale Slash, into Worldly Slash, or Shulk doing Slit Edge into Air Slash, into Shadow Eye, into Backslash. It can start to feel repetitive, but mixing up the characters you're using keeps the game much more enjoyable to me once it starts to feel like I'm going on autopilot. Now, I'm sure you could point to any game eventually getting repetitive if you continue to play over a long period of time, but the Xenoblade 1 combat system happens a bit faster than other games in the series. One of the reasons for this is the simplicity of the system. Now don't get me wrong here, complexity in combat does not necessarily make it good combat. Once again, Xenosaga 2 being a great example of that. But, in the case of a more action-based RPG like the Xenoblade series, complexity and options in customization and fighting strategy is one of the things that can keep the game fresh and enjoyable to continue playing. A perfect example of this is Xenoblade Chronicles X, a game that took the combat of the first game and expanded upon it in many different ways. Arts now have secondary cooldowns. The customization for your character was immense with the different classes, weapons, skills, and augments, and a mechanic known as Overdrive drastically increased how you could approach and experiment with the game by drastically lowering all art cooldowns and giving you many different things to keep track of in battle for maximum success. It's a heck of a time and extremely fun to experiment with, which is why multiple people still play and experiment with builds today, and it definitely makes Xenoblade 1 feel slow and lacking by comparison. Now, of course, this game initially came out after Xenoblade 1, so it can be a bit unfair to compare them in this way, but it also serves to show how the complexity and diversity of options in Xenoblade X allow it to have an interesting experience more of the time that is less repetitive and can keep you hooked for much longer. Xenoblade Definitive Edition lacks this depth in its system, and for many that can be a good thing since it's easier to understand and get into it. However, the drawback of course is that each of the 7 characters are more or less going to only have a few different playstyles at best, and mostly revolve around the same arts since some of your 16 arts are just better options to have equipped than others. Sure, you can swap between the characters, but it won't change how the only fundamental customization is basically just gear and gems, and the combat system itself is just an art palette to use as you like and chain attacks. This doesn't make it fundamentally bad either. There's still plenty to keep track of in combat, and still plenty you can have control over that makes the system fun. It's just that it will eventually get repetitive and there isn't much you can do about it. Fortunately, or unfortunately, that doesn't really matter much anyway because the game suffers a lot from a complete lack of good post-game content. Once you get the ability to build and optimize your characters more by getting all the best gems and equipment, there's nothing much left to even use it on. There are 5 super bosses in the game, and 2 of them are honestly really easy, leaving you with about 3 potential challenges. You can set yourself up to have some good builds to fight these enemies, but after that point, the only thing you can really do is continue to fight these super bosses over and over. Xenoblade 2 had a really nice challenge mode feature added and some extra difficulty options to really push the combat system to its limits. It seems like Xenoblade 1 was going to get this with the time attack mode, but time attack is honestly a complete joke. This was incredibly disappointing to me, given this was something I was really looking forward to. All of the free mode challenges, and there's only 10 total challenges by the way, can be easily beaten at level 99, with the hardest challenges just being much easier versions of unique monsters and super bosses. There is no actual challenge whatsoever, and the combat just falls flat on its face because of it. Restricted mode doesn't give you any freedom for build diversity and customization, which is one of the best aspects of the game, and instead throws you into these challenges where you have to play with what the game gives you. And honestly, these challenges really suck and don't really provide a fun and interesting experience, even if you could say that they are difficult, since much of them just come down to pure RNG for chain attack link chances. It's such a massive disappointment after the amazing challenge mode we got in Xenoblade 2 that keeps the game fresh and fun to play even now. All of these interesting character builds you could make have nothing to really be used on, and there isn't much to really test the limits of the combat system. Even the expert mode isn't really a difficulty, but just the in-leveling system from Xenoblade 2, which has its own benefits, but calling it expert mode is just silly. If leveling down is the only real challenge, then what's the point? Now, most RPGs don't really have amazing post-game, sure, but comparing this to something like Xenoblade X and Xenoblade 2, which have some incredible post-game experiences, it just feels like there isn't much here. Xenoblade 1 probably never had this much focus on this to begin with, and that could also explain why the combat system lacks complexity, but that doesn't make what we were given in this game any less disappointing, since time attack seemed like it would be the solution to that problem. If there was anything else about the combat system I feel isn't the greatest, it's probably the chain attack system and the visions. Chain attacks are supposed to be a way to give you an advantage in combat and do lots of damage, but for much of the game it's really RNG based on if you can actually get chain links or not, so it makes it difficult to actually rely on them. Pure RNG on whether chain attacks continue is not really good game design, and sure, you have ways to increase it to 100%, but by the time you get to that point in the game, you are once again almost done anyway. I feel like there could have been a better way to implement this. Visions are a mechanic that, in my opinion, completely interrupt the flow of combat when they happen. You have to watch an animation of something that will happen, and while figuring out how to change it can be fun, it's a bit annoying at times to have it constantly happen every time an enemy uses an attack, and the Vision React song interrupting everything is also really annoying too. Combat is also basically balanced around this, since your healing options are very bad and you're supposed to rely on changing the future to have success. Regardless, Xenoblade does have its fair share of pretty fun strategies, even if some are a bit cheesy like topple locking, and for the length of time you'll probably be using the combat system, swapping around characters should be enough to keep it fun and interesting for a normal playthrough. However, the lack of content to use the combat on, as well as the more simple system getting repetitive more quickly, makes it harder to enjoy a replay in the long run. It's a good system for the length of the game, even if it starts off slow at times, and it's a solid foundation for what the future systems would build upon. But in the long run, it's hard to see myself constantly coming back to this game like Xenoblade 2 or Xenoblade X. There just isn't enough for me to do with the system or within the game to enjoy myself. So what about other aspects of gameplay that aren't combat? The first and most notable thing I'd think of in RPGs is the side content or questing. There are 5 major areas in the game that have a large focus on community and questing, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail later, and over 400 side quests. That is an absolutely insane amount that trounces the number that Xenoblade X and 2 have. With all of these side quests, you'd think there would be a lot of great content. Well, there are a few interesting side quest chains in this game that are very much worth doing and enjoyable, but the problem is a large majority of these quests are really not that great. In fact, I feel like the side quests are one of Xenoblade Definitive Edition's major weaknesses that carried over from the original game. A lot of these quests seem to serve zero purpose and aren't really all that fun to do because they're very generic fetch quests or slay enemies quests without interesting stories behind them. Another major problem is because of how experience system works in this game, you are probably going to want to do quests so you aren't underleveled later in the game, which can also be pretty annoying. It's not exactly a hard gate like Torna Community, but it still feels like the game wants you to do the quest, which I've never felt like is a positive feature. The large affinity chart showing character relations can be pretty cool to fill out, but so many of these quests just makes it feel very tedious. I feel like Xenoblade X did quests so much better than this game by making them very compelling stories that fleshed out the world in almost every way. In this game, there are a few quests that do that, but the majority don't really offer much of anything to you, and you don't really feel like they're worth doing. Now, one really positive feature in this game is how much easier it is to do a lot of these quests, since you can track pretty much anything you need, which is an amazing quality of life feature added from the original game, and for that I am grateful since it decreased the tedium drastically. But that doesn't really make all 400 quests all that fun to do. Many of them feel like a chore even with the improvements just because the required objective and story behind it aren't all that interesting. It doesn't help that for the vast majority of these quests, there isn't much in the way of a meaningful reward since the only notable thing you get are 10 skill trees and 2 Monado arts. It makes the sheer volume of quests feel even more tedious with that in mind, so this is something I'm very glad they were able to improve on in later titles. The menus in this game and the other quality of life features made all improve the game a pretty great deal. The introduction of fashion gear was nice to make sure you don't have ridiculous looking characters in cutscenes should you not want them, and I think being able to buy certain things that are hard to get otherwise like art books, Colony 6 items, and certain gems from Time Attack mode is actually a very nice feature even if Time Attack mode itself is weak. I think in many ways these features actually do make the game more fun to play because there's a lot less tedium and more actually playing the fun parts of the game. Other features that I've always felt are particularly nice are the trading features to make getting many items much easier, and the achievement feature for giving you some more concrete goals to work for a dopamine rush when you finally get it. Some of the achievements can be a pain, but I'd much rather have them in the game than not having them at all because it gives you something else to strive for. I'm also really thankful that grinding is basically non-existent in this game, with it being very easy to get all the skill points, art points, affinity, and gems you need with some pretty minimal setups. Expert mode was a great feature to help with much of this grinding for skill points and art points especially, as well as just being a nice feature to challenge yourself more and keep your levels where you want them. There were also some great changes that drastically improved the core experience. If there's one other thing that I felt was weak about the gameplay, it's probably just the fact that the skill system is kinda boring and could have been more fleshed out to give characters more build diversity possibly, but they also really need more arts to also allow for that. Limited options is one of my biggest complaints, which is why I am very happy there's 7 playable party members. All in all, there's a lot of positive changes made to this game that make the core experience of the gameplay better, even if the fundamental things like combat and quest haven't really changed, and for that I think that makes this game much more worth it to play and enjoy. Xenoblade was the first game in the series to transition to focusing much on the world the story would take place in. I think because of this, it's very much worth talking about the world itself since that does have such a large focus in this game. There's a vast world for you to explore in the game that you unlock over the course of the story. There are some positive features to this, and some negative features to this that are worth discussing, and that usually just depends on the area you're in. So I wanted to break down all the areas in detail to discuss what I felt the strengths and weaknesses were. This section may be a bit longer than it should be, but I kinda wanted to just go in order of the areas you encounter over the course of the story. Naturally, the game makes a huge deal about how you live on the body of titans, which is a sick concept all things considered, and actually having a huge role you can see is amazing in theory, so it's definitely one of the things that makes this game interesting. The game starts off in Colony 9, and this is in my opinion one of the best areas in the game. It's your typical hometown area in an RPG, but how it's used as an area being initially so peaceful and then as the location for the catalyst for the start of the adventure is a great contrast that makes the area stand out more than most hometowns would. Additionally, it's a smaller area that has a lot of things to do with all the quests contained within it and has a tranquil atmosphere that's perfect for starting a journey. The OST of the colony inside the town itself sounds so peaceful and relaxing. For first-time players, it almost gives off a happy and nostalgic aura. And for returning players, a reminder of how easily that peace and happiness can be shattered. It isn't too big or too small, and honestly it's a perfect area for the beginning of the game. The next area you're going to venture into is of course Tephra Cave. This plays more like a dungeon than a larger open world environment, and basically serves as an introduction type area for many of the mechanics and features of the game. It's a pretty linear area with basically one path forward until the end of the area, but that doesn't make it necessarily bad. In a vacuum, Tephra is one of the weaker areas of the game, but its purpose seems to be more as a gateway to access what the world has to offer, and for that it does a good job of building the game before you finally get to the leg of the Mechonis. Is it a great area? No, and I doubt anyone is ever going to tell you it's their favorite area, but it does its purpose very well. Once you leave the cave, you'll look off into the distance and see the Mechonis, and it's here where the scale of the areas begins to pick up as you realize how large and vast the game truly is. After climbing up the vines and going through a narrow passageway, you will arrive at Mechonis Leg as the camera pans out and shows you how vast and large this area is. It's one of the best moments in the game, and the presentation really helps nail the fact that this game is huge and you're in for a ride. Now, as great as the actual presentation of this was and how you'll probably never forget this moment, the area itself isn't as great as it seems. While it seems vast and huge on the surface, there isn't actually all that much for it to warrant it being this big, and with how the movement speed is in this game, it can take a long time to walk anywhere meaningful given the lack of skip travel locations. This is one of the areas that feels like the scale is much bigger than it needs to be, with the only real area of note being the refugee camp where most of the actual story events occur. The few things that happen on Mechonis Leg are all along the same route you need to take anyway to get to the next area, and despite being so big, the area is still pretty linear and empty. Sure, you can go out of your way for some landmarks and unique monsters, but there isn't actually much reason for the area to be so large practically. Having an area be big or having a bigger world isn't always a positive feature if there's a lot of emptiness to it, and I feel like this area suffered a lot from that. The movement speed capped in this game also doesn't help either, since you could traverse it much faster in something like Xenoblade X, which wouldn't make it nearly as tedious. Still, it is a pretty environment and a decent area to really begin the adventure. The next area you enter is technically Colony 6, but you barely do anything here before entering the Ether Mine, so we'll come back to it. The Ether Mine is easily one of the worst areas in the game, and I doubt anyone's ever going to argue with you on that. It's a very boring environment with mediocre music and pretty much nothing interesting about it. It's pretty much entirely linear for the first part, with some very small side pathways that basically just lead to gems you can mine should you really want to. I think one of the major problems in the area is how the part of the story that's connected to it also isn't that great, so it drags down the area even more. Even the gameplay parts of this feel like a major slog. After completing it, half of it gets locked off and the other half is very sparsely used in quests, so it feels like there isn't much purpose to it existing as an area. Upon completion and doing another fight, you'll make your way into Tutorial Marsh, which is absolutely one of the better areas. It isn't nearly as large as Bionis Leg, and everything interesting is much more compact and easy to access. It looks beautiful at nighttime and has a lot of small things to do to make it stand out as one of the better and more memorable areas of the game. It's certainly one of my personal favorites. Towards the end of the marsh, you'll get access to Colony 6 fully. Colony 6 is a bit of a project. You're supposed to build it up over the course of the game, and honestly it's something I really enjoyed. I feel like it's one of the best areas just because it's really cool to see everything you're building grow over the course of the game as more and more features and quests get unlocked. Building the colony itself can seem like a pain at times, but this game added a very nice quality of life feature, and honestly probably the best part of Time Attack mode, and the fact that you can buy literally every Colony 6 item in the Time Attack shop in exchange for Napon Stone. This really limits frustration later on with some of the rare materials, and makes Colony 6 much less of a chore, and in turn, much easier to see in a positive light. The constantly changing music as you built it and seeing the town grow larger along with the plethora of things to do make it one of the premier areas of the game, and this absolutely huge side quest being probably the best total side quest in the game. The next major area is Machina Forest. This one is a bit strange because the main part of the area you're in 90% of the time is a really solid area for similar reasons to Satoral Marsh, with it being much more compact and having a lot of things to do within the space it has. Thing is, there's like this huge water section and small river that serve almost zero purpose outside of like 2 or 3 quests that comprise a huge section of this area. It feels utterly pointless for it to be there, but luckily you won't ever have many reasons to venture out into this section anyway, so I can't really complain about it too much. As far as the rest of the area, it's excellent. One of the best areas, as I already said. Not too linear, not too big, lots of cool things contained within it. Frontier Village is the next place you'll stop on your journey, and probably a place you'll be coming back to a lot if you care about questing and completion because it has the most in the game. Whether this is a good thing or a bad thing really depends on what you think of the quests. The area itself doesn't have much to it. It's a vertical area where everything ends up being pretty compact, which is very nice. Personally, as far as the community areas, this one would likely be my least favorite just because I felt like a lot of the quests here were less interesting, but that's beside the point. The next area we will venture to on our journey is Aerith Sea. Honestly, this is one of the prettiest areas in the entire game, and it has a great environment to it. The OST here is top-notch, and that only makes the area even better. Now the thing about this area is that it is massive. There's an entire sea underneath these hovering islands. Now, funnily enough, you only have to swim a few times ever should you want to get to a few islands you can't access with the teleporters, so it's a bit odd that this area is so large given most everything is contained within all the hovering reefs, which is a very small percentage of the total area. The reefs also aren't all that large either, so it isn't really as big and vast as it might seem to be because of that. There's pretty much no purpose to 80% of the sea because it will never be used. As far as everything that's on the reefs, it was really nice how the teleporters were used, and the area basically being one giant oval makes it not feel super linear even if you eventually have to go on the story paths, so it did very well in that regard. Personally, I like this area a lot, but this is another odd design decision like Machina Forest that seems to make the area much bigger than it really needed to be for the purpose of making it seem like a very, very big world. Alcamoth is the residential area contained within Aerith Sea, and personally it's one I felt could greatly benefit from more skip travel points as well as the skip travel points remaining open after Mechonis Core. There's a lot of walking in this area if you're looking to traverse it, and there isn't really much reason for this area to be so large and all the characters so spaced out compared to all the other residential areas that are so much more compact by comparison. I know this is supposed to be some grand imperial capital, but there's just so much unnecessary walking, especially for certain quests that require you to go to far-off NPCs multiple times with no skip travel points near them, and that just wastes so much time. This area should not feel larger than New Los Angeles. It reminds me a lot of Indal and how there's just so much walking in that section of Xenoblade 2 that just takes you out of the game much of the time when you just want to keep playing. As far as general atmosphere and presentation, it's still a pretty neat area, so it does have that going for it, but it isn't all that great from a gameplay perspective. You have the High Entia Tomb shortly after this, which is a pretty short area and extremely straightforward. I personally think as far as the more linear dungeon type areas in this game, this is one of the better ones. It has a nice environment to it and there's nothing overly frustrating about any part of it, plus it actually helps expand the lore of the game greatly rather than being like the Ether Mine, which feels like it doesn't actually serve a major purpose. The first trip to Prison Island is basically a walk forward and do plot, so there's not really much to say about it, so next area we're going to actually get to is basically Valak Mountain. Valak Mountain is a very pretty area, especially at nighttime. It has one of my favorite area themes in the game, but it's honestly not a great area at all. It's a big and mostly empty mountain with so many things scattered all over the place that you will likely only ever need to visit for one quest each, if that, and for how huge the area is, there's not much to really do. The skip travel locations are extremely scattered and you can be walking in this place forever. I feel like because of these factors, it ends up becoming one of the weaker and more annoying areas despite how pretty it actually is. It's a lot like the Bionis leg where it feels very big and empty for much of the time you're traversing it, and it isn't actually all that fun to navigate. Sword Valley comes right afterward, which is a bit of an interesting area and the start of the Mechonis themed areas that don't really have much to do in them because they'll all be locked out later on. Much of Sword Valley is going through these large gates, and honestly for a dungeon type area I like this place. I think it has a good environment to build suspense for the next part of the game. Galahad Fortress comes right afterwards, and it's basically just an extension and continuation of Sword Valley, since it's basically just a smaller dungeon area once you get inside that you go through to the end and fight the boss of the area. Once again, I like this area for what it is and think the story section of this game is executed well enough to make this place memorable. After the events of the fortress, you'll be sent to the Fallen Arm with your party members spread out. Fallen Arm is easily one of the best areas in the game. It has probably the best character moments in the game and is a very cool area with a lot of things to do without feeling like it's too large and vast. It has a great OST and the hidden village inside of it really feels like one of the better questing areas because of how much quicker you can get the area of affinity since there's a lot less quest overall. It's easily one of the most memorable locations in the game to me and what I wish many of the other areas in the game were like. Mechonis Field and then Central Factory afterward basically feel like they're part of the same area and part of one really long dungeon. The Central Factory OST is great and really builds us to reach the climax of the game, and for that I do appreciate it. I think it's one of the best area themes in the game easily. The areas themselves I've personally never been the most fond of. Once again, like Sword Valley, they'll basically be areas you lose access to forever after a while, so they don't really put many missable things here, and as such it doesn't really feel like there's an incentive for exploring these larger areas unless you just really want the unique monster affinity coins, so it feels more like a dungeon than a vast open world environment. I think these areas could be better if they weren't areas that get locked off and as such had a bit more to do in them, and I think Agnaratha handled this a lot better. Speaking of Agnaratha, it's also an area that will eventually be locked out, but actually has a lot to do within it with the quest that it can give you, and is one of the coolest areas in the game. It's an abandoned, technologically advanced city with great music and a great environment that I think make it memorable and fun to experience. The quests make the area have purpose, and the reward of the secret area actually makes it feel somewhat worth it. It's also not too large, and it's actually very fun to explore, so it definitely left a pretty high opinion on me. After a lot of story events, the next area you'll really go to is Bionis Interior, which is not really a great area. It's a more dungeon-based endgame area, and much of it has nothing of real value, so you'll likely just want to finish the story by the time you get to it, and it features a boss fight that a lot of people don't like either. It feels really boring to me and not really fitting of a final area, but luckily we get a different final area that actually fills the part in the form of Prison Island. I really like Prison Island. It feels like what a final dungeon before the final boss should be. Great environment and music and a lot of really cool things in it like the final heart-to-hearts and strong enemies to fight along the way. It's visually appealing and something that certainly isn't forgettable, and for that I think it serves its purpose extremely well. Overall, I feel like the areas in this game are pretty solid all around. The environments are all very pretty and there's many memorable areas. I think some of the areas suffered from being too vast and not much to do within the vastness, or just not being very interesting since it was a more dungeon-based area, but there isn't all that many negatives to say on this front. I think better movement would have helped alleviate many of the problems as well. The jumping is pretty pathetic and the walking speed not the greatest considering the size of the world they wanted to build, and this again was another thing they fixed in later titles like X, which had an even larger world but a lot more to do and a much better way to traverse it. I feel like for being the first game in the series with a heavy focus on world, it did a nice job in making its world feel good and memorable, and that's really all you can ask for with a game like this. I'll try to keep this next subject very brief, but a long-time point of controversy within the community has always been the anime art style. especially the style and direction the games went with Xenoblade 2. It's a bit interesting to me that this was ever a controversy if you look at the roots of the series, and even in Xenosaga 3 you have these character models and art styles that look very similar to Xenoblade 2, and the only reason the original game didn't look like Definitive Edition was because of the Wii's limited hardware. Definitive Edition adopted this new art style for the game, and for most this wasn't an issue because it legitimately looks really nice. There was some controversy over it not being as realistic anymore, but this seems like a ridiculous complaint. Realism in games doesn't always mean it looks better, and I personally think the art style is perfect for the series and allows for the characters to have more expressive and emotional moments, which I think is very important for a game like this. The style has always been one I've enjoyed personally, and I've never been sure why this was so controversial. Graphical improvements make the game look much better than it did on the Wii, but that kind of goes without saying. If you like visual updates, then this game did that extremely well. Another thing I wanted to briefly mention is the OST. Now, music is an extremely subjective thing, so I'm not going to sit here and objectively rate it, but I think the OST is one of the biggest strengths of the game. Honestly, it's one of the biggest strengths of the entire series. It may seem like a small thing, but music is one of the most important aspects of a game to me. As our dear friend Citan from Xenogears would say, music is a mysterious thing. Sometimes it makes people remember things they do not expect. Many thoughts, feelings, memories, things almost forgotten, regardless of whether the listener desires to remember them or not. And while quoting some game character in a video like this might seem a bit weird, I think this does ring true, and music can be super impactful for the entire experience. Especially if you're coming into this game with nostalgia from the original game, the remastered soundtrack can be one of the best parts of the game. While I wouldn't say it's the absolute best OST ever, since I still have to give that to Saga 3, this game easily has one of the best OSTs I've personally ever heard. I really like Tragic Decision, that was probably my favorite song of the remastered soundtrack, and I think a lot of the new orchestrated music was really well done. I just wish there was a bit more variety in combat music. What I love about many of the other games is many enemies have their own unique themes to feel special. Regardless though, great music can make a great game, and I think Definitive Edition succeeded very well in that front. Alright, let's get into the meat of everything here, and probably the major thing many people love this game for: the story and the characters. And at the risk of making multiple people mad, I don't really care much for the story and characters in this game. It's not that it's bad, it's just that it's not as good as everyone makes it out to be, and there are multiple things I think it could have done better. It's certainly not Xenoblade X level of bad by any means, but one of the most common praises of this game is how great the story is and how it's so much better than Xenoblade 2, which is something I've just never really agreed with. I hope you'll be willing to hear me out as we dissect the story of the game and take a look at the characters afterwards. The game begins by explaining the basic lore of the world, showing off the Mechonis and the Mechonis and their battle. As a premise and idea for a world, it's super cool and automatically gets you more invested in the world than a vast majority of RPGs out there. We get to see this huge battle and then the future battle between the residents of each Titan afterward. The game starts off a year prior to the rest of the story during the Battle of Sword Valley. This is a nice little prologue to the game by giving some background to the eternal war being waged between the two sides of man and machine. It introduces us to Dunban and his two trustworthy and wonderful friends Dixon and Mumkar. We can see right off the bat Mumkar doesn't actually want to be here and expresses his desire to live and come back for the Monado later, and after a short tutorial fight he ends up running away very predictably. We then see while he's running away he trips and gets targeted by a lot of Mechon and is seemingly killed, except we don't actually see him die. Now in all of my experience, one thing I can say for certain is that if you don't see a character die, they are not dead. Usually in these little prologue cutscenes they like to give insight to some characters and events that could be important later on, so almost anyone watching should immediately know Mumkar will be coming back as an antagonist. Dunban has his hero moment afterwards and injured his arm pretty badly, but the important thing is the Mechon forces have been pushed back and the forces of the Mechonis were victorious. I think this cutscene was very effective in what it set out to do, and was a great way to set up the game and show us how much potential this game could have. After this, we're sent to the present time and introduced to our protagonist, Shulk. While out there, he's attacked by a vicious Crabble and has to be rescued by his supportive best friend, Ryan. With their combined efforts, they vanquish their foe, and Shulk tells Ryan not to go out by himself because the big strong Ryan man will protect him. This is supposed to quickly establish their relationship as friends and make Shulk seem somewhat weak so he can grow later on. He talks a bit about what he's doing out there and gives us some insight into who he is and how he's studying the legendary Monado sword that is the only weapon that can hurt the Mechon. This will obviously make you immediately question why and make you interested about the sword itself, especially after seeing Dunban in the prologue, so this is an effective cutscene for accomplishing that. Once Shulk gets back to the lab, there's a conversation with Dixon about the Monado, and Shulk talking about it being more than it seems, and kind of further establishes that this game is about the Monado, just like the original title of the game, Monado: Beginning of the World. So naturally, the sword should be pivotal to the plot of the game. Afterwards, we get to see our hero Dunban again in his handicapped state and are introduced to Fiora, his sister, and someone who is another friend of Shulk's. What we learn about her right off the bat is that she cares greatly for both her brother and Shulk, and this is further exemplified by her going to find Shulk in Outlook Park. It's here that their relationship is established a bit more, and the game tries to showcase the importance of Fiora to the people around her. She then says the most obvious line you should absolutely never say about how she wishes every day could be like this, so you know something really bad is about to happen. So far so good, a bit too obvious with some of the foreshadowing, but the beginning sets up the game nicely and gives it a lot of potential. We go back to the lab and see Ryan being stupid and establish that the Monado cannot cut people, which seems to be an important thing to note for later. Shulk then picks up the Monado himself and starts getting a vision of many of the important events and cutscenes that will happen during the game. Now, I'm personally not a major fan of something like this because in many ways it can ruin the surprise of things that happen in the future of the plot. For this particular moment, it's not that bad, but it does become a bit of a problem later on. I think the visions are better suited to be used in events that could be changed mostly, and not showing things that will happen no matter what. That complaint aside, this cutscene begins to set up the fact that Shulk can see things that will happen in the future, which will become extremely important over the course of the game. Our hero set out to Tephra Cave for our basic little intro dungeon and how to play the game section that has extremely low stakes, and then at the end of this, the colony they call home starts getting attacked from the air by Mechon forces. So much for that piece. Now, obviously something had to happen for the journey to start, and this is our big event. Our heroes, including Dunban, all head towards the Monado, and when the lab is blocked off, then they get surrounded and things are at their most dire. Shulk and Ryan tell Fiora to leave to protect her, and our hero Dunban comes in to save the two of them with the Monado. After fighting off the Mechon forces, it's clear that Dunban cannot go on, so the torch gets passed to Shulk as he runs and picks up the Monado and seems to not only have no difficulty, but get visions of the immediate future, allowing him to counter and defeat the Mechon. If you ever forget that Shulk can see into the future, no worries, because the game will remind you a lot. Regardless, we finally have a glimmer of hope in this dark hour, and then our heroes meet Metal Face, the big, scary Mechon with a face, and for some strange reason our Monado that cannot hurt people cannot hurt this mysterious-faced Mechon. I don't know why that is, because it seems very odd to me, and those claws he's using seems familiar, but I'm not making any assumptions here. Now, after we learn we cannot harm him, we get the cutscene Lost, which is the catalyst for the story and what many people consider to be the hooking point of the game. Some might even call it the cutscene that changed everything. And while I won't be making a 20-minute analysis on it, I can agree it is a very well-executed cutscene. Essentially, our heroes are absolutely powerless, and Fiora decides to fight Metalface by herself. Shulk sees that if she does this, she is going to die and is powerless to stop it, and despite all of his screaming and pleading, he cannot change the grim reality as he watches the person he cares about more than anything get killed. It is very much a tragic moment, and unless you're just dead inside, it's impossible for it to not have some sort of emotional impact on you when watching, because the voice acting is excellent, Shulk's desperation and anger is perfect, and the scene is just executed beautifully. Now, I would argue that there is actually a potential problem, and it has nothing to do with how great the cutscene itself actually is, because it is indeed an effective hook for the narrative of the game. However, when this cutscene happens, as the player, you have seen Fiora in cutscenes for like 10 minutes total, and used her in battle a couple of times. I have no reason to care about Fiora yet. I've only seen minor parts of her character that almost every nice girl in video games has. The game briefly tries to establish a bit of character relationships before this happens, of course, but it isn't really enough. Outside of shock factor and Shulk's own reactions, there isn't really anything to make me super emotionally torn about this moment, or care that Fiora is dead later on into the game, and I think this is one of the things Xenoblade 1 struggles with the most. This game is very much plot-driven and not character-driven. It focuses very heavily on its narrative and story it wants to tell, and not much on the cast, and it doesn't really feel like they're fleshed out or people I should care about as I'm playing the game because of it. For me, I really like being invested in the characters when I'm playing the game because it makes the emotional impact of the story much more potent if I have a lot of characters I care about reacting to the events that occur. Establishing character relationships and growth over the course of the game is super important to me personally, which is why I love the stories of Xenosaga and Xenoblade 2. Those games start slower and don't have the super instant hook like this game does, but the slow start allows for there to be a lot of background and allow me to connect with the characters before the crap hits the fan, which should make the emotional impact of tragedies such as this hit much harder. I'll talk a bit more about the character writing and such later on, so let's get back into talking about the story. After Fiora's death, Shulk expresses his desire for revenge and talks about the two sides of himself, which is also some really obvious foreshadowing, and Shulk and Rein set off on a classic revenge quest with Dunban saying he'll be right behind him, and this is where the journey begins. Unfortunately, after this amazing intro, the plot kinda peters off for a while in my opinion and doesn't really get that interesting until Alchemoth. In Tephra Cave, there's a bit more insight given to Shulk's vision power, and we get an introduction to Alwas in Shulk's dream telling him all about his new powers. With these new powers unlocked, Shulk is able to save Rein after receiving a vision of him dying with a new Monado power, showing that he can actually affect these visions, and as such, the game is going to transition to Shulk trying to change the future with the power of the Monado. The Bionis-leg story section honestly isn't all that interesting to me. We're introduced to Juju and his sister Sharla, and learn about how the Mechon attacked Colony 6, so all the survivors are living in a refugee camp. Honestly, I think Juju is kinda just a plot device character, but he's also not as bad as many people would paint him to be. But for this section of the story, his only purpose is to nearly get himself killed, so Shulk can unlock more of the Monado's power, and change the future once again to save our new friend Sharla. And I guess Juju too. It's literally just a repeat of exactly what just happened with Rein and Tephra Cave, except it's a different Monado art and different characters are saving, so I really don't see why the same plot device was repeated, especially since there's no actual antagonist yet. We got some background on Juju and Sharla before this, of course, but it was very brief and once again does nothing to make me actually care about either of them before we literally spring straight into the plot once again. After the fight to save Juju and Sharla, another terrible foe appears. This time another faced Mechon, and we learn here that these faced Mechon can actually talk, and surprise surprise, our Monado still doesn't work on them. Wonder what that could mean. Anyway, Juju gets kidnapped again, and now we have to go to the Ether Mines of Colony 6 to save him. As I already mentioned earlier, the Ether Mines really suck. Zord is a character with zero actual depth to serve as a very temporary antagonist who is just comical at times, with this whole motivation being that he wants to eat everyone, and it's hard to really enjoy this section of the game just because the plot itself really isn't going anywhere, because it's still trying to show how Shulk can change the future now for the third time, this time with our new friend Otharon, without actually giving a focus to the plot outside of that. There's still no end goal to anything outside of just saving people we meet on our journey and getting revenge. It's getting almost formulaic at this point, which isn't really something you want your plot to do, and the characters themselves aren't really doing much of anything to help me care about anything that's going on. Regardless, despite being unable to hurt Zord, he gets plunged into an ether river and Otharon is saved. Our heroes try to escape and Zord comes back to fight but is severely weakened. Once we're about to finish him off, he gives us some insight into how the Monado isn't unlocked yet, so it feels like maybe there's a more tangible goal to work towards now. Outside of the mine, we are attacked by the metal-faced Mechon who reveals he can talk, and his voice sounds a lot like another character, but their name just slips my mind at this point. Wonder who that could be. Anyway, the true hero of the story, Dunban, comes to help us defeat all the Mechons surrounding us, and the metal-faced Mechon who can't be harmed by us is taunting us and hinting that he has a connection to Dunban, and that he enjoyed killing Fiora. The game obviously wants you to hate this guy and take him a bit more seriously than Zord, and then Shulk gets another vision while fighting that shows a lot that's going to happen and gives us some more hints into how we unlock the true Monado's power. I'm not really a fan of this vision because it's not like it's foreshadowing, it's literally just telling you things that are going to happen, like the Monado eventually being able to hurt Metalface, and basically spoils that the Emperor is going to die just because of how it's different from most of the other visions we've seen so far. Not really a fan of this because the game isn't exactly making anything subtle here in its plot. Afterwards, Metalface gets chased off by a Telethia who was sent by Alwas, who seems to be a mystery man working in the shadows. Afterwards, Shulk talks about his vision to everyone, and it's decided that the group will head to Prison Island, and Dixon foreshadows that he knows way more than he probably should compared to everyone else, since he seems to know all about it and how to get there. As we forge ahead, we see Shulk thinking about everything that's happened and get to see the vision scene again for the second time, and Dixon once again starts talking about how Shulk is part of some higher plan in the least subtle way possible. And then the story continues by them basically talking about where they're going to go, and Dixon at the end of it literally admitting that he is deceiving them as if it wasn't already obvious enough that something is off about him. This game is very bad at being subtle, as you might have already guessed. Satoral Marsh is a great area for the game itself, but plot-wise literally nothing happens here, which is pretty disappointing. There's a few small character moments focused around Shulk since he's the main character, but that's about all, and they head into the Bionis to get some world lore and take note that it seems like it's breathing. Afterward, we finally seem to pan to a completely unrelated section and meet Vinaya for the first time and see a human being placed into a faced Mechon. Who would have guessed that these faced Mechon who could not be harmed by the Monado were people? Furthermore, they make it extremely obvious that this is Fiora and that she's not actually dead. It happens very early on in the game, which is why I've always been surprised people consider this a big spoiler, but I guess maybe if you aren't paying super close attention, you might miss it. So this is actually interesting since the entire point of this story was revenge for her death, and her not being dead but also being placed into a mechon could make the plot turn an interesting direction depending on the execution. Maineth is also name dropped, finally hinting at a more overarching plot. Afterwards, we see the girl in Shulk's vision, Melia, fighting against some Telethia with some soldiers. The soldiers basically die to protect her, and she charges up an attack and the cutscene ends, and we go back to our main characters who are just talking about the new location they're in. We then get to see the vision for the third time in case you missed it the first 2 times, and still don't know what's going to happen. Shulk thinks to himself about everything, and then they forge ahead and find Melia unconscious on the ground. In order to help her, Shulk goes off by himself to get some water crystals and finally meets face to face with Alvis, but doesn't seem to recognize him. While here, we learn that Alvis is a cool guy who seems to know everything about the Monado and just randomly unlocks a new power for Shulk to use against the Telethia because why not? As soon as the fight is over, he vanishes, and when Ryan finds Shulk, he thinks he's crazy when Shulk tries to tell the story of Alvis. This introduction to Alvis was actually really well executed, and I think makes him a more interesting character than most of the cast by this point because everyone is interested in learning about him now because of what he just did and how he seems to not only be able to use the Monado, but unlock more of its power easily. Upon reuniting with everyone else and healing Melia, she slaps Shulk because it's funny and then agrees to help them for saving her. There's some mystery about who she is as well, but most people probably aren't going to care much at this point compared to what we just saw with Alvis. Afterwards, we get to Frontier Village, and your opinion of this place will likely depend on how much you like or dislike the Nopon. Not much really happens here story-wise, as has been the case for a while, but we do get a bit more insight into Melia to make us care a little bit more about her, and we agree to help her stop the Telethia. While we're here, we also get an additional party member of Ricky, who is apparently a hero pawn because he is in debt to the village. He appears to be joining us to be a comic relief character and mascot, and whether you like him or not really depends on if you actually find him funny or not. We then go and defeat the Telethia with the power of the Monado, and Melia starts to wonder why Shulk is so great. Once again, I don't think much of the plot in this area is that great because it just feels a bit of a side story, and they don't even give much time to flesh out the characters during this section, outside of a little bit for Melia and Shulk. Even Ricky, who just joined us, feels like he's just along for the ride and doesn't really contribute anything meaningful to the plot. It feels like the game is just losing focus at this point, and while maybe they were using this part of the game to introduce characters, they don't really give them much to work with to make you really care about them as the cast because the game is too busy focusing on Shulk and the power of the Monado the entire time. We also get some really weird cutscene with Lorithia and a Telethia in a test tube. Finally, though, we're able to head to Eretz and then on to Alchemoth, the home of the High Intia race of people that have isolated themselves from everyone else. We also learn that Melia is the crowned princess of these people if you somehow didn't pick up on that before. Melia then leaves the party and everyone else gets arrested, and we learn it's because we had the Monado, and Alvis formally introduces himself to the party. He decides to let them go free and continues to act cryptic about his own knowledge and makes himself more interesting than pretty much everyone else once again. We go on a little side quest unrelated to anything with the plot afterwards, and then we learn about a plan to assassinate Melia by having her do a trial not done in years. Naturally, the move here is going to be to try to save her once Shulk gets the vision that she's in danger. He's able to convince her brother to let them go save her, and Alvis decides to join the group while they go. This seems like the first time they're trying to give a decent character arc to someone besides Shulk, so I do appreciate this part of the game. I'd say it's probably the first time I got interested after the introduction of the game. It still feels like a bit of a side subplot to everything else going on, but it's still nice nonetheless. In the tomb, we learn a bit more about the High Intia and how they've been trying to integrate their dreams with Homs for a very long time for some reason, and unlike every other foreshadow in the game, it's actually unclear why and not completely predictable or shown to you, so I actually really like this part as well. Anyways, the heroes are able to successfully save Melia, and the real plot starts to pick up again as some unknown character says to begin the assault on Bionis, and it's revealed that the Emperor knew he was going to die because we see Alva showing it to him for the 4th time. I think these sections of the game did a good job of making the people care about Melia because she's a lot more popular than most of the other characters in the game. Before leaving for Prison Island, we get another vision showing that he dies for the 5th time, and now it's time to head to Prison Island, the place we saw the other vision a long time ago. On the way to Prison Island, there's a bit more lore about the world itself revealed since it has a bigger focus in this game for better or for worse, and once on Prison Island, probably the second series of important cutscenes after the start of the game happens. The giant we've been seeing in the vision gets summoned by the Emperor, and once our heroes arrive on the scene, he calls himself Zanza. He's also been waiting a long time for Shulk. Apparently this is the guy who made the Monado, so we can finally get all the answers we need. Apparently the Monado was so powerful that he was imprisoned for that reason after fighting the Mechonis. Seems very likely. I'm sure there's nothing else going on here with this dude. Melia tells Shulk not to free him, and Shulk does it anyway because he doth desire the power. The Monado now has the ability to hurt people, and Zanza is immediately killed, or presumably anyway. And then we instantly learn, even in this state, he's somehow still alive and is communicating with a new-faced Mechon with thought waves, and the new Mechon seems to foreshadow the fact that Zanza isn't actually a great guy here, talking about all his sacrifices and whatnot. So now it seems like the game is going to be getting interesting, and we're all curious about who Zanza is now. This new Mechon isn't trying to fight us, but Metalface really seems to hate all of us, so he's attacking us, and it seems like he definitely knows who we are. Wonder who this guy could be. Anyway, he kills the Emperor as we already saw 5 times, and for some reason everyone is shocked that this actually happened despite knowing well in advance, but fortunately Shulk finally gets his Monado power up, and we're able to actually harm Face Mechon finally. It looks like we're finally gonna get revenge for Fiora's death, and then the other Face Mechon tries to stop us from fighting, and we learn the person we're trying to avenge is actually alive! I'll admit, I think it could have been a lot more interesting to make her an antagonist for a while, but this seems to make the dynamic of the story shift a bit since the reason for the revenge plot is no longer there, and now it's just going to be about saving Fiora, who seems to have lost her memory and been replaced with this Lady Maneth person from an earlier cutscene who is aware of Zanza and seems to think he is a pretty bad dude. There's a lot to unpack in this cutscene, but I'd say it's definitely the point where the plot actually starts to pick up again and things finally start happening. It definitely isn't subtle about painting Zanza as a future antagonist here, and perhaps there's more to this Bionis and Mechonis war than it seems. If you kinda got pulled out of the game a bit, this is likely where it pulls you back in. Melia's father gives some parting words afterwards, but I can't really find myself being sad about it since we still barely knew anything about him and knew he was going to die for a very long time. Still, it makes people feel even more empathetic to Melia, so maybe that's their goal here. After that, we learn about Zanza, that is predictably that he's still alive, and that Alvis appears that he might be working with him. I think this was pretty cool because now we're all even more curious as to who Alvis is and what his own motivations are. It is then decided that the group will pursue Fiora as their new goal and head to Sword Valley where everything began. On the way, they must pass through Valak Mountain where we get a bit more lore about Alvis and the Monado, which is actually just all lies, funnily enough, as we learn later on. The important thing that happens here is that Maneth in Fiora's body tries to come meet us, but Metalface comes and attacks her and holds her hostage. After the Monado is placed down to try to save her, we learn that Metalface is actually Mumkar, Dunban's old friend from Sword Valley, and absolutely no one ever saw this coming. This section of the game seems to be for the purpose of having this be some kind of big reveal and give some shock value that a former Hobbs would be capable of this because of his own jealousy and selfishness, but it was so obvious pretty much the entire time I played I couldn't really be shocked by this reveal. I kinda think that this weakens the impact of everything going on, but luckily after we're given our first formal introduction of Egil and his Bakugan, the Yaldabaoth. This seems to be the major enemy we're fighting against, so finally we have a goal and know who we have to take down to hopefully resolve all of this. He takes Fiora away and our journey now must continue on to the Mechonis. I think the Egil part of this cutscene was really well done, so no complaints there whatsoever. We get to Sword Valley and meet up with our old buddy Dixon, who once again says some weird things about how things are getting interesting when we explain stuff to him, and I'm sure that doesn't actually mean anything. Almost immediately after this, we get our final showdown with Mumkar, which is also really weird because we literally just saw him, and he's again just being spiteful to Dunban because he hates Dunban and doesn't seem to have any motivation outside of this for his actions. Once Dunban is about to kill him, Shulk actually stops him and says he's a person, so they shouldn't kill him. Now maybe this is character development for Shulk since he initially wanted to destroy all Mechon, but I think it hits more at his two sides thing and the empathy that exists within the side of Shulk that's actually himself. Regardless, Mumkar ends up causing his own demise instead and falls to the land below Sword Valley and dies for good. A fitting end for a character consumed by his own hate. After this, we learn that Dixon, Lorithia, and Alvis seem to all be on the same side, which implies they all work for Zanza. Honestly, this game doesn't even try to hide that fact, and one of my friends who had never played before completely predicted it well before Mechonis' score, but we can talk about that when we get there. It's just a bit more proof that the game really lacks subtlety in its foreshadowing, which kinda makes the plot less interesting if you can easily guess what's going to happen. From there we enter Galahad Fortress. Most of the cutscenes inside the fortress just talk about how you're going to contribute traveling within the fortress, which is kinda pointless to me, but I guess they're there. Once you reach the end of the destination, we learn a little bit more about Egil and his motivations to destroy all life on Bionis, as well as his power to control all Mechon. He easily seems to be able to overpower us, and we learn Fiora and Maneth are being controlled by him. The Monado gets deactivated by his Apocrypha, and he's immediately established as a powerful antagonist that we will not be able to win against easily. When all hope of victory or escape seems lost, Fiora fights Eggel's control in an attempt to save us, and most of the fortress gets destroyed, and the mech Fiora was in falls down to the sea below. Shulk jumps right in with no regard for his own life afterwards, and it's assumed that everyone else falls down as well besides Eggel, who's wondering how she was able to defy him. I think this entire section was very good. One of my favorite parts of the game for establishing Eggel as an antagonist actually worth caring about, as well as giving him a dangerous presence for suspense and even despair. Fiora being able to overrule the mind control is a pretty common thing in fiction, but it's still something I really like to see, and I think this part was very well done. And the goodness doesn't actually stop there, because now our heroes are at the fallen arm of the Mechonis on the sea below, and this is one of the best areas in the game for character interaction, which is something this game is sorely lacking in. The first thing that happens is Shulk kissing Fiora to save her, because this game hates Melia, and the game firmly establishes her as the main heroine of the game from here on out. There's a brief talk about what Meyneth wanted to do, and Fiora wanting to carry out her wish, so now that she's been saved, it appears that is going to be our new goal. There's some really touching and emotional moments between the two of them about Fiora's new state, and honestly, this is the kind of stuff we needed before Fiora died to make us care about her more. Shulk promises he will protect her from here on out, which is a little bit cliche, but it was still good at the same time. Next, we pan over to Ryan and Charla, who have been separated from everyone else, and once again, some good character moments here for Ryan, and this interaction is really solid. Same thing happens with Ricky and Dunban at a campfire that night, where we get a bit more insight to both of them that I thought was very touching and cute. This is absolutely what the game needs more of, instead of just going straight plot focus and going from area to area, only doing that. After all of this, the party is finally reunited, and the story begins to resume as normal. Now they're in a weird new location known as the Hidden Machina Village, and as it turns out, the Mechonis has people that live on it as well, and they don't actually support what Eckle is doing and want to live in peace just like the people of Bionis. We get a lot more lore about the world and the battle between the two titans while we're here. This game really does do a great job with its world building and lore, and I do think that part is one of its greatest strengths. We learn about the leader of this village is none other than Eggel's father, and he wants us to climb with the Mechonis and kill Eggel. It seems Eggel is blinded by revenge. This entire section paints Eggel more as a tragic villain, so you can kinda tell the plot is gonna work to confront Eggel, and then likely Zanza afterwards. We also pan over to learn more about the allied forces of all the Bionis races getting ready to fight the Mechon, so it seems like the game is about to reach its climax. I think the game did a great job of building suspense here, and I think it's still doing a really solid job with its overall plot at this point, and I'm curious to see how all these issues are going to be resolved. Some maintenance is done for Fiora's new body to give insight into exactly what she is now, and then we meet up with our old pal Dixon, who once again knows a suspicious amount about this world, and it's super obvious at this point that he is not the guy he claims he is. Finally, we're able to leave for the Mechonis capital, Agnaratha, and while climbing up Mechonis Field, not much too exciting happens until we get a cutscene focusing a bit more on Fiora, who is now established as the second most important character on this adventure despite only recently joining, and then we get some small moments related to Charla, who has been completely neglected since she was introduced up until this point, that makes it obvious the next enemy is going to be her beloved Gadalt. This game completely lacks subtlety in this front once again, and wouldn't you know it, we fight Gadalt right afterwards, who's been completely brainwashed. Honestly, even despite this, Charla barely gets anything here despite being used as a plot device to give a new enemy, so I can't say this grand reveal really does all that much for the story itself, since they just needed something to tie us over until we get to the major fight of Eggel. After Gadalt tries to kill us all and then disappears, we finally see Eggel again and learn that this man absolutely hates Zanza once again, so it seems like the game is pretty firmly laying out that our final antagonist is going to be Zanza. How we get there is going to be the interesting thing. We get another cryptic dream with Shulk and Alvis talking about the true Monado, and then our journey finally continues. Benea appears and gives us even more lore about what happened to this world, and finally reveals to our heroes that Zanza was the real bad guy all along, and she just wants us to help us stop her brother. She says she'll explain more when we get to Agnaratha, and we pass through each central factor where literally nothing happens in the story. Literally nothing, and then we finally get into Agnaratha. And once we get there, wouldn't you know it, we get even more lore as Meyneth in Fiora's body explains what the capital used to be like, and all about what actually happened in the battle between the two titans and how she opposed Zanza all those years ago. This game really does have some great world building and lore surrounding its world, but I do feel like there was such a large focus on this in the narrative that it makes other aspects like the characters suffer, but at the very least I think all of this lore is still nice for making the world feel more alive. After learning it all, we have a bit more insight into Egil and decide we have to stop him and explain to him that his approach is all wrong. When we're about to try, we get stopped by Gadol, once again, who seems to be slightly malfunctioning, and we learn he still has his heart somewhere, so you can probably figure out where he's gonna eventually remember and help Charla since Mechonis says she'll help us out. And then we free Gadol from Egil's control, as expected, and go confront the man himself. Gadol has a talk with Ryan telling him to take care of Charla, which is basically code for he is about to die helping everyone. Especially because it's been trying to establish this romantic relationship between Ryan and Charla the entire time, and Gadol here would throw all of that out of balance, so he is gonna have to disappear. Well, we go to fight Egil and learn why he is doing what he is doing. Apparently all the Homs are is a life force for the Bionis to feed on, which is why he's trying to kill all of us. It's all for the sake of defying Zanza. After a brief talk trying to convince him that all lives can live in peace, we see that talk is cheap and we fight him. When the fight is over, we get the very cool line about how our blade cannot cut deep enough and Tragic Decision starts playing and Egil establishes himself as an actually good antagonist. Won't go into all the details, but he still won't change his beliefs and will defy Zanza and even Mechonis, who has taken our side, until the end as he works to avenge his fallen brethren. We have reached the climax, folks, as Egil goes inside the Mechonis and prepares to become its new soul to destroy Bionis, and we're gonna just have to stop him. While we're getting away, Gadol sacrifices himself to make sure we can do just that, as you might expect, and we all run away from the explosion. As far as the plot of this game is concerned, this is probably my favorite part. I think this is when the plot hits this peak with writing and the events going on, and my investment in the story is at an all-time high. This section of the game is very well done and one of the highlights of the plot of the game. Afterwards, we see the fallout with the Mechonis beginning to awaken and our heroes discussing their next course of action. Dixon seems to be aware of Mechonis and talks about how it's time to finish this in the least ominous way possible as Alvis looks straight at him. And then we get ready to leave for Mechonis Core. Fiora gets some character moments with Vinea because she's the main heroine, and once we get to our destination, Shulk wonders why he was called Zanza, which definitely isn't some more obvious foreshadowing. This entire section before the fight is basically showing that something is wrong with Shulk, and that we're about to find out what's happening very, very soon. The game then repeats a lot of the same things we already know as it's prone to doing much of the game, and then Shulk and Fiora talk to each other to try to develop the two of them a bit more. Shulk even grabs Fiora by the hand while Melia watches just because they really just want you to feel bad for Melia. After destroying the generator, Dixon and Alvis talk for a bit to give even more signs that Dixon is up to something and make Alvis seem as cryptic as ever about whose side he's actually on. Although, being honest, it's pretty obvious he's on Shulk's side if you ask me, given he keeps appearing in his dreams and doesn't actually seem to care for Zanza's will or his world like Dixon does. Afterwards, we finally start the final decisive battle with Egil, which is probably the coolest fight in the entire game, both gameplay and lore-wise, and we have to stop him from destroying the Bionis completely. We're able to win the fight, and the third series of extremely important events happens. Shulk is about to kill Egil, and the voice inside him even tells him to do so, but he remembers everything that has happened and realizes that that is not who he is and decides not to. He tries to make peace with Egil, and after talking to him a while, it seems like he's going to be able to turn Egil to his side finally in a moment of great triumphant glory as they finally understand each other. And then, the completely unexpected thing happens where Dixon shoots Shulk in the back. Holy crap, you mean Dixon was a bad guy the entire time? Wow, I literally never saw this coming. Dixon is revealed as Zanza's disciple, and Zanza comes out of the body of Shulk and somehow looks almost exactly like Shulk. He starts talking about some cryptic nonsense about how all of this was destined to happen and starts bragging about how he's a god and none of you kids will ever be able to stop him from restoring all life to the Bionis, and it's kinda just not great. The story was really going well before this event occurred, and then we got this extremely obvious plot twist for the sake of having a plot twist, and now we have this new villain who sounds like every other JRPG antagonist ever, and the plot is now turned into we have to kill God. Egil tries to help us now, but is easily stopped, and even Mechonis tries to help out and tries to talk some sense into Zanza, but is still defeated, and Zanza takes her Monado, and the Mechonis is destroyed. So Zanza is now the major and final antagonist of the game. That seems very obvious, but how we got there is honestly just kinda silly. Some people really seem to love this cutscene, but it just seems so dumb to me the more I see it, because Egil was actually a pretty cool villain, and now we have basically moved on to this guy without much interesting about him besides the fact that he's a pretty boy. He starts talking about fate as he leaves, which is also just kind of proof that we're now gonna just defy our fate and defeat him as you might expect. We're left with the currently lifeless body of Shulk that is now taken with us, as Vinea says bye to Egil, who now fully supports Shulk in stopping Zanza before he tries one final time to defeat Zanza and then dies. Poor Egil, he really deserved better. Dixon tries to stop us from getting away and is now totally embracing his jerk bad guy role, and after this, we get an actually good plot twist of the full-blooded Hyentia actually being transformed into Lethia, which explains why Melia was the hope and future ruler for not being fully Hyentia. I actually really like this because it's one of the only things I didn't see coming and was genuinely shocking and really made the stakes feel much higher. Callan, being a really cool guy, resists the control of Lorithia as long as he can and plunges into her and Dixon so our heroes can get away in a pretty emotional and sad moment. Back at Colony 6, Shulk is now lost in his dreams when Albus appears to him, which signifies he's likely still on Shulk's side. We get some character development moments with Fiora and a bit with Melia before the colony is attacked again. Shulk in his dream has a long conversation with Albus about if the world is his or Zanza's, and Albus once again seems to be more than he lets on. Shulk then decides he's going to be the cool epic guy and save everyone after waking up from his dream because no one can do anything without him. Albus is revealed to be working with Zanza, but not actually working with Zanza at the same time, and we push back the enemy forces as Albus asks one more time if the world is his or Zanza's. From here, we decide to head to the Bionis interior, since that's where the heart of the Bionis would be. While there, we see Lorithia and Kikalian, who has been transformed into a Telethia, and fight one of the more annoying fights in the game. Lorithia, being an extremely boring and annoying villain, doesn't really make me very invested in the things happening at this point as we're defeating her, and then we get Melia's final moments of relevance as Callan's spirit seems to appear and talk to Melia about how she's the hope of the Hyentia once again before him and Lorithia disappear forever. Honestly, it is a touching moment, but everything else surrounding it is kinda not that great and I don't really care for it that much. Dixon appears out of thin air afterwards and tells us to go to Prison Island, which will be the final dungeon of the game. We fight a bunch of cool things here, and the environment is perfect for setting up the final battle, so no complaints there. After going all the way through and having to deal with Dixon acting like a super generic bad guy for some reason, we finally get to fight him and see his true form. While they're fighting him, everyone talks about how really cool Shulk is and how he can defeat him with his power, and it starts to feel really cliche, which is not really the direction I wanted this game to go, but whatever, I guess. Shulk and Fiora have a cool speech, and then we're finally able to defeat Dixon, who just dies in peace as we go to confront Zanza. They try to make Dixon seem like he's proud or something, but they didn't really give any complexity to his character the entire time he was revealed to be a bad guy, so this just comes across as a bit weird, like they shoehorned it in at the last moment. But hey, if you want to feel bad for Dixon, this scene is here. Finally, we can now go slay God with the power of friendship, a really unique thing that's never been done in any RPG before. We start walking around in space before getting there, which is kinda trippy, but it does fit the themes of the other Xeno games, so I'm actually glad this part is here. Finally, we confront Zanza, who can't really see anything past our confrontation despite supposedly being a god, and then our fight begins. After fighting him for a bit, once again, Shulk and Fiora start giving a speech while the rest of the characters barely say anything, and they will win no matter what, and suddenly Shulk grows another Monado through the power of the friendship that they have, and then they fight a little more, and then Albus starts talking from nowhere and reveals the universe they're in is basically a simulation inside his own database, because he's a supercomputer or something, thanks to an experiment performed by Zanza a long time ago, and then we kill God epic style with our new true Monado, which was basically what Albus was talking about the entire game. We then get the experiment scene, which was not changed at all in this game, even when it should have been changed to match the Xenoblade 2 canon version, but instead we get this incomplete version that doesn't really tell us much of anything. And then Albus starts recapping the entire story we already know for zero reason at all, and then tells Shulk he's now God and to make the universe as he sees fit through his Zohar magic power. Shulk does the cool line about how they want a world with no gods, and everyone then lives happily ever after, and we have a cool ending scene where everyone is happy and Fiora has short hair, and they're basically canonically together because poor Melia. The ending is pretty standard here with nothing very special about it, and the fight against Zanza was decent enough. I just think it got a bit too cliche and boring at the end compared to what I was expecting. Mechonis' core fight was great, but afterwards the story kinda goes downhill to me, and the last hour or so of the game just feels like I'm watching some generic shonen anime. Was the overall story of the game good? I'd say yes. Is it some amazing masterpiece? No, not really. There's a lot of weaknesses here, like the repetitive plot points, especially early on, weak character interactions, and the fact the game is extremely predictable at many points, and even outright spoils you itself at others that made me not think as highly of this story as others seem to. I'm not gonna sit here and say other games in the series have a perfect plot, but they definitely pulled me in more emotionally and had more memorable moments. I didn't ever feel like I got really invested until about halfway into this game, and then the peak really was Mechonis Core to me before the events happened afterwards that took me out of it and became a bit cliche. I wasn't a major fan of how it's super easy to tell what happens, and there isn't a lot of deeper elements to the writings. It's a very surface level game that focuses on the story it wants to tell and not much outside of that. The main theme is kind of just molding your own path to the future, which isn't exactly something I would say is revolutionary. I wish there was just more to this game, honestly, because I think it had a lot of potential, but in many cases it focuses on the wrong things or didn't really do anything that innovative to make the story stand out to me. It's a simple story without much depth to it, and that is okay in many regards. They needed something simple since Xenosaga was unfortunately a commercial failure. Still, I don't see what makes this story so amazing that people consider it to be one of the best stories ever, since I do think Xenogears, Xenosaga, and even Xenoblade 2 all do outclass it in this regard. Again, I'm not going to say the plot of this game was bad by any means, but it definitely has weaknesses that make it not stand out as some untouchable masterpiece. But we can get more into that in this next section of the video where I talk about all the prominent characters in a bit more detail. So let's start things off with our main cast, beginning with the main character of this adventure, Shulk. Shulk, being the main character, naturally gets a lot of development over the course of the game, and in many ways this entire story feels like it's very much his story and focus extensively on him. He has a lot of good character growth over the course of the game because of this, and I found his arc to be executed very well. We learn about him having two halves, his own struggles, how he overcomes them, and starts acting according to his own will. His vengeance eventually turns into desire for everyone to coexist, which was something pretty natural and pretty good progression. He has good moments interacting with the rest of the cast that help further his own character, and his relationship with Fiora is extremely important to the direction of the overall story. I honestly think he's probably the best written character in this game, but that also makes sense since he's the protagonist and naturally will get a lot of focus. I do think some of the ending of the game is a bit of a weakness where Shulk basically just turns into anime protagonist boy who will decide the future himself, but besides that and before that, up until Mechonis core, I think Shulk was really nice. The problem with this is that Shulk ends up being so central to everything that everyone else suffers. The game almost entirely revolves around him and the Monado, and oftentimes many of the characters are basically just talking about Shulk, or how they wouldn't be able to do anything without him and the Monado, and it really feels like it weakens the other characters in so many ways because they can't even do anything without Shulk. He is so much of a driving force in this game, and the narrative takes such a priority that Shulk getting so much of the spotlight and praise actively harms the other characters and makes it harder to get attached and appreciate them. And for many of the other characters, they don't have much in the way of their own character development at all. Shulk himself is good, but the spotlight on him really hinders the rest of the cast. The first example you could mention here is Ryan, Shulk's hot-headed best friend. Personally, I find Ryan to be one of the better characters, but he also gets more time than much of the cast to have character moments since there's a long section of time it's basically only him and Shulk and then Sharla. I think the sections of the game that show him doubting himself since he used to be the one protecting Shulk, but now he feels like a hindrance, are actually really well done and something I would have liked to see more of. I think this would have given him a much better character arc instead of it only being briefly mentioned and then nothing really happening much with that from there on. He basically just stays as Shulk's supportive best friend the entire time and in some ways acts as comic relief, and I feel like he had a lot of missed potential for someone who should have been a more important member of the main cast as someone who was there the entire time. We're basically just supposed to like him based off of personality alone, which I don't really think makes a super effective character. He doesn't really do much in the latter half of the game, which is really disappointing and makes it hard to get super attached to him, but sadly he is not the only one. Sharla is one of the characters who feels almost irrelevant the entire journey as if she's just along for the ride. She gets reason to join you because Yuji gets captured, and once he's saved she kinda fades into the background until it's convenient to make her somewhat important again to make Gadalt an antagonist. I'm sure they were trying to make her seem important by doing this since she hadn't done anything for a while, but it doesn't really make me care about Sharla on any significant level. She doesn't really have much going for her outside of this, besides betraying Melia and helping Fiora get Shulk because poor Melia, and much of her character seems to be trying to have some kind of pseudo-relationship with Ryan since she always mentions how he reminds her of Gadalt. She doesn't really have much of a character arc, and I feel like she didn't really change at all over the course of the game, and I find it very difficult to care about or get attached to her since she doesn't really have a major involvement in the plot. Dunbane as a character is interesting because he really has a lot of potential as a fallen hero type, and the Battle of Sword Valley really showed how cool he could be. I feel like he could have been someone who struggled with loss and revenge the most, and at some points it felt like they'd go that direction when he tried to kill Mumkar, but for much of the time he joins, he's really just turned into the wise mentor character and info dump character, which is not really what I wanted to see out of him. Besides his brief moments with Mumkar, he doesn't really do much of anything after joining, and he just becomes another victim of Shulk syndrome where he just helps Shulk instead of really having his own unique character. Maybe having him be supportive like this is good also, but I definitely think he deserved his own little arc to give him a bit more character instead of just being this nearly flawless mentor type character. It also feels like anything he could have had a nice arc about was just made about Shulk instead. Oh, did Dunban's little sister die? No, it was Shulk's love interest. Dixon is Dunban's friend? Sure he is, but he was also Shulk's father figure. Even the metal face stuff is mostly about Shulk. He has a lot of cool moments over the course of the game, and while he is cool, he's also pretty static, and it doesn't help that all of his plot points that could have made him more interesting are basically given to Shulk. Static characters aren't always a bad thing, but I feel like he's someone who really should not have been static given how personal many of the events of the game should have been to him. I can't say I like him as much as most of the fanbase, but he still is pretty decent in my eyes. I just wish he was so much more. He's a perfect example of missed potential. Melia is the next character we get, and she actually does get a lot of focus during the game. She has her own character arc, she gets a lot of growth because of it, and the player can connect with her a lot more also. She even gets to have a sense of closure for all the negative events that happened in the game that affected her and Future Connected, but we'll get more into that later. All the stuff with the High Inti was pretty well done as far as actually making you care about Melia, and the stuff with Kalyan especially makes you care a lot more about her since Kalyan is a cool dude for a side character. If the other characters got the same kind of treatment she did with their own little mini-arc that still contribute overall to the plot, I think I could have liked them a lot more. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of Melia personally since I think there really shouldn't have been this weird love triangle dynamic going on, but at least she has something going for her during most parts of the game. Now, after Fiora joins, she does start to fade away a bit, but you could also argue this is intentional and she actually becomes relevant again at certain points even after that. As far as the main cast, she's definitely one of the better characters writing-wise, even if I haven't gotten super attached to her myself. Ricky is basically the character who is literally just along for the ride and acts as comic relief. I don't care for Ricky much and have never cared for Ricky much. He has virtually no character development at all, and outside of one touching moment on the Fallen Arm, never does anything of value. I will never understand what makes him so well liked because I feel like he was just so irrelevant much of the game, and the only thing he really has going for him is being the cute mascot character, and I just couldn't bring myself to care about him for that reason. He's probably the weakest character in the entire main cast, and it feels like he really doesn't have any purpose to be there. And now we get to Fiora. Fiora, despite not even being in the party until like 60 to 65% of the way through the game, is basically the main heroine and becomes the other important character besides Shulk when she joins, basically pushing almost everyone else into the background. Her initial death came a bit too quickly to get attached to her before, so the game tries to make it up for by quickly giving her a lot of focus, whether about her body or how she wants to help Shulk, and all that typical stuff you might expect. Personally, I think her being alive may not have been a good thing because it's completely changing the course of the story and the dynamic of everything, but that's likely a topic for a different video. It's undeniable that once she joins, she makes the other characters feel even less important though, as the game now focuses extremely heavily on Shulk and Fiora and their relationship. And I think Fiora's character after rejoining is alright, but there isn't really anything here besides I really love Shulk and want to help him. It's cute, but it doesn't really make her a very complex and deep character. In fact, if you remove Shulk from the game, she would have almost no purpose, whereas at least the other characters have a bit more to them. Now, she is very cute, so maybe that's a good reason to get attached to her, and she actually does have a lot of relevance in the game as far as being the reason for the plot to begin, and getting a lot of focus when she does come back, so she does have that going for her, and I think she does that job pretty well. I just wasn't always the biggest fan of it. As far as more supportive ally characters, I don't really see why Juju gets so much hate outside of being a plot device. He's kinda just there and wants to rebuild the colony afterwards, certainly not as annoying as characters like Tatsu or hateable as characters like Bose. Juju is a good boy and he really doesn't deserve the hate. Stan Juju. I don't really have much else to say about him, so he doesn't really do much. Kalyan is probably the best supporting character in the game to me. His relationship with Melia and him being a great supportive brother makes him really likable, and all his moments in the game actually helped Melia have a pretty solid character arc, so he does exactly what a supporting character should in that regard. Vinaya and Meyneth serve basically as characters to progress the story more than anything else, but Meyneth does help give Fiora more of a character art and a bit of development, so I'd say she's actually pretty solid as a supporting character. Vinaya is cool, but I don't actually see much purpose to her besides being a plot progression and lore dump character and humanizing Egil more, but maybe that's what she was supposed to do the entire time. Otharon and Vangor, I guess, are characters you could name drop, but they don't really do much, but I do appreciate their presence in the story, I suppose. So let's actually talk about the antagonist now. We'll just go in order here. Zord is first up, and he's basically the Saturday morning cartoon villain of the game, and there's almost nothing interesting or noteworthy about him. He's comically evil just for the sake of it, and I kinda groaned every time he'd talk or be on screen. Fortunately, the antagonists get a bit better from here on out with Metalface or Mumkar. Now, Mumkar is also comically evil in a way, but at least he has a bit of a reason for his action based on his jealousy for Dunban, and as a villain, his presence and actions were a lot more horrifying than Zord, which makes him a little bit better and more memorable. I'm not gonna say he's like the greatest villain ever, but for the point of the game he appears in and for what his purpose is, he does a great job as the main antagonist for the first half of the game. Could he have been a lot better with some better motivation and character writing? Yeah, he definitely could have been, but he's still alright. The next real antagonist at this point isn't really one since it's just Gadult and he serves as more of a plot device that we can eventually change to get his memories back. I'm not really a fan of the Gadult thing at all since it just felt like filler for the Eggle stuff, and I think he's kind of weak as an antagonist as a result. Fortunately though, Eggle is easily the best antagonist in the entire game and probably the second best written character in the game. He is written to be a tragic villain more than anything who suffers through a lot of pain because of what Zanza did to him and desires revenge like Shulk. In many ways, he parallels how Shulk was when he was first leaving Colony 9, which is another reason I think he's effective as an antagonist. He has really good motivations, and his method for why he's doing what he's doing actually makes sense to vanquish who he sees as his enemy. His desire for revenge blinds him to the fact that the people of Bionis aren't his enemies, which makes it all the harder to actually have to fight him. Even upon his defeat, he's able to see he's wrong and grow as a character before finally being betrayed one final time by Zanza's disciple, and sacrificing himself in one final moment to take down a sworn enemy. I think Eggle as a character was great at being an effective antagonist, and his arc was the highlight of the game. One thing I do wish is that he showed up a bit more. He's not really relevant at all until Valak Mountain, and I think it would have been great to give the game a better focus for an antagonist by introducing him early and starting his development sooner like the major antagonists in the other Xeno games that are basically there the entire time. Regardless, Eggle is still a great antagonist that carries much of the game. Unfortunately, our three remaining antagonists are not nearly as good, and the worst of these is Lorithia, who is basically just another person who is evil to be evil. I don't care about Lorithia as a villain at all. She's a pretty horrible character with no depth or anything to her, and I don't really have anything to say outside of that. She's not relevant for very long anyway. Dixon, on the other hand, is a lot more relevant. Now, the Dixon thing is basically foreshadowed extremely obviously throughout the entire game, but there seems to be some glimpses into Dixon's thought that makes him seem somewhat regretful, so he actually could have been a really nice, regretful villain, but instead, after his big reveal when he shoots Shulk, he just turns into a generic-sounding bad guy, which is such a stupid way to take his character, when he could have been so good. I still think how the plot twist was handled was really dumb, and his actual character afterwards was so stupid as well. And even if they tried to redeem him somewhat as he died, by that point it's just really too late for me to care about him being a good villain, and as such he suffers a lot as an antagonist for someone who should have had such a big emotional impact on the cast as the reliable guy who was always there for them, especially as Shulk's father figure. Why is he now just a generic bad guy working for Zanza? It makes no sense to me, and the writing for him has always just seemed awful, which is why I can never care for much of the ending of the game. Speaking of Zanza, what a weak final antagonist compared to what we just saw with Eggle. This dude has no motivations outside of selfishness and is just basically the stereotypical arrogant god. There's not really any strong writing going on with his character, and nothing to make you emotionally invested in him at all or flesh out his own character. Part of that is because he doesn't even appear until the very end of the game and doesn't really have time to build his own character, and this is such a big weakness for writing an antagonist like this. He needs to be around more instead of just appearing at the end if you want him to have a good character. Otherwise, he's just the generic overconfident god that's just going to be beaten at the end of any RPG. Never been a major fan of him, but his design is sick though, so I do have to give him that. There's one final important character to discuss, which is Alvis. Alvis is one of the most liked characters in this game, and to be fair, he is pretty cool, but I always felt like he was a bit of a budget chaos from Xenosaga. Now, Alvis is a very static character, but he's actually supposed to be because of what he is, and I felt like a lot of his story moments were actually the most interesting just because of how his character was handled. You're usually never quite sure what his goals and motivations are, and that's actually kind of rare in this game, and the only reason you're able to guess he's helping Shulk is because he constantly appears in his dreams and says a bunch of cryptic things to him about unlocking the Monado's power. Now, it's pretty much confirmed he's Ontos at this point also, and he basically acts as the gateway to Xeno being what it is since he seems to possess Zohar powers, and for that he's a super cool guy. Now, the supercomputer ending meme before we all knew it was Zohar shenanigans back in the day was a little out of left field, but it at least makes sense retroactively now. Regardless, just the mystery of who he was actually was pretty interesting for a plot point, even if he himself never gets fleshed out that much, and I can see why he's one of the most popular characters in the game because he really is just that cool at times. Is he someone I got attached to and liked a ton? Not really, but I do think he serves his purpose in the story pretty well. Overall, the character writing in the game definitely is not the strongest, especially compared to the other games in the series, and that's probably the biggest weakness of the overall story as a whole. The character writing being weak makes it hard for me to get attached to the characters, which makes me less invested in the story, so I don't get as emotional at certain moments of the story. There's not really enough character interactions to establish really good relationships that I think could have made the game a lot better. Sure, there's some heart-to-hearts, but only 24 isn't enough to really flesh them out, and even if the heart-to-hearts were really good, I don't think character development should be an optional content like that. This is probably the biggest weakness of the game, and it's probably the main reason I don't care for the plot and story all that much, because I just can't get invested in most of the characters like I'd want to, even if they are decently likable. Character arcs are very important to include in game narratives to me because good characters are something I value greatly. Maybe this isn't a big deal to you and you think I'm dumb and Xenoblade 1 is still a complete masterpiece, and if you think that, I'm happy for you, and I'm not telling you that you should think like that, trust me. This is just what I got from the game when I played personally. I think maybe one of the reasons people really do like this game so much for its story is how incredible the English voice acting is, which makes many part of what's actually going on easily able to be overlooked. Regardless, I think that covers every individual aspect of the game I wanted to discuss, so let's move on to discussing Future Connected before we conclude this video. This video is really long already, so I'll try to keep this part brief. I'm just going to come out and say it straight. Future Connected is a disappointment and I did not care for it much. Maybe not because of the content it had itself, but more so because of what it was hyped up to be as a hint to the future of Xenoblade or something. Maybe my expectations were too high because there's really nothing like that here from what I can tell unless we're having a return of the Gnosis or something, since that's basically what the Fog King was. So the general premise of Future Connected was that it would be a side story focused on Melia, Shulk returns, and then we also get these two Nopon characters, Nene and Kino, who are the children of Riki. It takes like 5 hours to beat and maybe 9 to 10 hours to 100%, so it's a very short experience meant to act as an epilogue. Most everything about the mechanics and gameplay of the game is the same besides a few changes to combat with the removal of the vision system and chain attacks, and addition upon specters which lets you perform all-out attacks from Persona 5. I think this is fine for the type of short game this is, so certainly don't have any complaints there. As far as the rest of the game, it was one of the big selling points to older fans that this game would have a new epilogue story, so what we got was definitely a disappointment. Let's break it down. So Shulk and Melia are traveling to the shoulder of the Bionis a year after the conclusion of the main story. They want to go to Alcamoth, but while they're on the way, they get shot down by something. Once they land, they notice Kino and Nene are in danger and decide to go help them out. Nene and Kino then decide to tag along with us as new party members. We go to a residential area on the shoulder where some High Entia soldiers are hiding out who explain that what we got attacked by was the Fog King, a mysterious creature who couldn't be hurt by any weapons. We also meet this evil-looking Gaelgore who will absolutely be an antagonist in the future. Now initially this setup seemed like it could go somewhere cool and I immediately got Gnosis vibes from the Fog King's description. The story then takes us to Alcamoth where we get to meet this Fog King, and yeah, I got serious Gnosis vibes from it. I was honestly really hyped at this point to see where this was going, and I wanted to see what was going to happen. We also learn how the Fog King can infect things and turn them into fog beasts. After running away from there, we go back to the lab with our new friend Teelin, who has been researching all of this stuff, and we also meet Tyrea, who is basically Melia's half-sister, and part of the only fully voiced quest in the main game. There's a bit of character interaction here, as you might expect, to make both of them a little bit more fleshed out, so that part is pretty neat. Our four brave heroes decide to head to Grandel now, which is the major residential area on the shoulder, after this in order to meet someone who might be helpful in stopping the Fog King. At some point during this, a rift opens up outside of Alcamoth, which starts converting enemies outside of Alcamoth into these fog beasts, which ends up becoming an issue that needs to be stopped. We then head back to Teelin's lab for some more notes and see him and Tyrea being attacked by Gaelgore for some reason, and Gaelgore goes on about how he's racist and how Melia will lead them to the future, and when Melia rejects him, he goes all crazy and says he'll lead the High Entia instead. You fight the dude, and after beating him, he literally disappears with no sense of closure unless you actually do a lot of side quests, which is really odd to me, but whatever. The rest of the game is devoted to stopping fog beasts and making all of the High Entia people unite, and then finally Shulk creates the sword that can make an ether wave, which is basically the Hilbert effect to stop the Fog King. After doing this, they go and defeat the Fog King, and all the rifts and everything presumably close, and the game ends with Melia becoming the new queen of the High Entia people, and finally becoming the hope of the High Entian she was told to be the entire time. Now, I probably could have covered it in a bit more detail, but basically all you need to know is hardly anything actually happens. The game ended well before I thought it would, and there was basically no answers or hints into what the future of Xenoblade would be, and I felt very disappointed after beating it. The closure given to Melia is nice, but if you don't really care much about Melia, then this story is not going to keep you very invested in it. As far as Nene and Kino are concerned, both are pretty likable, but the game isn't long enough to really give them any time to grow as characters, so they suffer from much of the same problems that many characters in the main cast suffer from. I don't really feel much attachment to either of them because of it, but I did enjoy using Nene a lot, so I guess that counts for something. The shoulder itself as a gameplay area is actually really cool, possibly my favorite area in the game just because there's a lot of stuff here, and the area is very fun to explore. I definitely think this was the highlight of the game, just the gameplay sections on the shoulder itself making it very fun to play. I wish it was a longer experience with more to it like Torna, but I guess it was never advertised as such. Still, I can't help but feel disappointed because it really feels like there's just nothing here. Sure, you could try to draw some deeper meaning from it, and potential Gnosis shenanigans are cool for Xenosaga fans, but outside of that, there isn't really much of anything actually happening here. Even the Gaelgore plot point just gets completely dropped after fighting him once, which makes it super forgettable, and makes me wonder why I should even bother taking it seriously. To me, this didn't live up to the hype, and as someone who isn't super attached to Melia, I just can't bring myself to care about it that much. Well, for better or for worse, Definitive Edition is pretty much just the same game as the OG with some nice quality of life changes and a short epilogue. Pretty much nothing was changed outside of that, and if you really like the OG game then this is a good thing. Perhaps if you were looking for something more like myself though, it can feel lacking in a way. Don't get me wrong, I had fun playing and experienced the game again, and all the improvements made the experience better. But I do wish there would have been some more changes to fundamental gameplay, or some certain cutscenes to make the game even more enjoyable. Instead, the only real change was a cosmetic change with Alva's key being turned into the core crystal. As such, my opinion on the game hasn't changed too much either, since FC didn't really add much to the game for me. I think the gameplay is reasonably solid, but hasn't aged the best since the other Xenoblade games are much faster and dynamic, and offer more customizations and options, and I think the story and characters aren't quite up to par with other Xeno games either. Well, except Xenoblade X, which is easily better than in that aspect. Regardless of that, Xeno is still my favorite RPG franchise of all time, and Xenoblade 1, and thus Xenoblade Definitive Edition, will always have a special place in my heart as my introduction to the series. All of the quality of life changes are very nice for making this game the best way to experience the first Xenoblade Chronicles game, and it's something I definitely recommend for anyone looking to get into the series. It may be the most simple, but it's a great introduction and something that makes the transition to the other games that much easier. I'd still say it's in my top 20 or 25 games of all time, which is still very high honors, and across the board in every category, it's pretty solid. Is it an absolute masterpiece? To me, no it's not. But that's okay, because it's still just a solid game, and a great game that I'd recommend everyone experience at least once. And if this isn't for you, then I still encourage you to try out all the other games in the series as well, because this series really is just that good. Although I'm sure everyone can find something about this game to like, and I hope you all have fond memories of this game and series as well. I can't wait to see what the future of this series has in store. If you've somehow made it this far, I want to thank you so much for watching this video, and I really hope you enjoyed this analysis and thoughts of the game. I have no idea if this video will end up doing well, but I definitely put a lot of work into it because I really wanted to express my thoughts about it. And if you disagree with some of the stuff I've said, I hope you'll be able to see my perspective on it, and if you want to discuss anything further, just let me know in the comments. This video ended up being much longer than I expected, so I truly hope it was interesting to you. If you enjoyed this video and my other content, I would encourage you to subscribe to me, as well as like and comment and support me in any other way you can, and I'll be more interested in making this kind of content in the future. With all of that said, one last big thank you all so much for watching and supporting me, and of course, as always, have a wonderful day.